we talked a little bit about case law and litigation and needing to fight the battles in the courts. And Roberto, the normal case is challenging the refusal of information. How else can you use public interest litigation on FOI for structural changes?
Well, the usual case is about refusal, but refusal not always is about denial explicitly. So usually the cases are coming after silence and after inaction from the state side. Litigation is a key strategy, I think, as was said before, to create a case law and to create, even those cases where, like in Argentina, we don't have a federal law, but we have the judges who are pretty much open to allow for requests and for claims. I think that we have to start building up the concept of information through case law. That's a very important, I think, avenue of work in litigation. Helen was mentioning the importance of not limiting the idea of access to information to documents and to broadening the idea of what kind of information is the one accessible to citizens. And I think that that's a very important thing we can do through litigation, because we will never do that through legislation, because you cannot be so specific. For instance, I mean, in Argentina, the government has been manipulating the calculation of the inflation index, for instance, and the consumers. It's called the consumers index, consumer price index, and we filed from my NGO a case against the government based on our right to information. We need to know what is exactly the procedure and the way in which you are calculating this index, because we are interested in working with poverty issues, and we need those figures because we need to know the data. And in that case, I think it's a very controversial case, because we were not looking for a document, we were not looking for a photograph, we were looking for information about how the government is doing something. And this is something that can only be discussed in the context of a case. I mean, it's hard to identify all these little things in the legislation. So, I mean, this is only one example. I think that litigation is crucial to opening new avenues of work on access to information.
And I guess final question before we go to our break. What I see as one of the major challenges is that the threat that access to information will provide an incentive to policymakers not to keep records or to engage in cell phone governance.
Yes,
it's very difficult, but it's nevertheless a serious concern. We've actually got some litigation that we're preparing to the European Court of Justice, where we've asked for the documents relating to the new transparency rules of the European Union. And we've got partial access to these documents, but we've been denied, they've blacked out the information about which states are proposing which amendments to the transparency rules. And one of the arguments that they're using is that if they were to release this information, it would discourage states from making written proposals for reform of legislation. And therefore, it's necessary to keep it secret. I mean, it's amazing sort of confession in a way on the part of the European Council, frankly, that if we have to give you this information, we're going to have to stop writing it down. But at the same time, that is kind of quite frank, that there is a danger. And we do have instances of non-meetings and of things not being written down. And this is where I think, again, if we take access to information as a right, the right has to carry with it certain obligations, the obligation to collect information and the obligation to set down and to keep a record. And we mustn't lose sight of that. Because otherwise, if we get too good at requesting information without that complementary part of the right, we're going to find that information isn't recorded. So that's something that we have to keep working on, possibly litigating on as well.
I'm Darius Chuplinskas from the Information Program. My question is about unintended consequences of FOI. Not just laws, but more broadly the work we do around freedom of information. On the one hand, you just talked a little bit about possible unintended consequences inside governments, where once you have strong FOI, it's possible that key information and decision-making processes move into back rooms and hallways and completely out of the limelight. Another unintended consequence is on the user and citizen side, where access to information without the ability to do something about it can engender cynicism and apathy. And a kind of a milder form of that problem is the fact that often FOI, the most prominent uses of FOI are by tabloids for scandal mongering. In fact, the way the Telegraph in the UK has played out the expenses scandal has, in my opinion, on the one hand, that information has to come out and it's good that it's happened, but on the other, it's actually quite damaging to the democratic process in Britain. It's been, if you look in detail at those disclosures, most of them are trivial. If they'd come out individually, they would never have received much attention. And it's been a huge distraction. Britain is in a massive crisis right now, economic crisis, political crisis, that preceded this scandal. And this scandal has been a huge distraction, much of it on really trivial issues of who spent how much on a duck pond.
The government needs a so-called space to think. I mean, it's not to be a wide space to think, yeah? But the hugest mistake in UK was that they didn't respect the decision of my colleague Richard Thomas. And then, you know, the black market starts operating. And I think the FOI should be, in a way, a purist legal procedure, because we need an appeal body which has a lot of knowledge in the FOI and other exemptions within the law to decide whether some things can be public or not. But if the government does not listen to those kind of decisions, then they have to bear in mind that the black market, that the investigative journalism will do its own work, and this is bad.
There is a concern about unintended consequences. We talked a lot about this UK scandal, but it's a good case study. My analysis is slightly different, that it's not a distraction. My analysis is that it's the last drop of water. That Britain is in a financial crisis, that there has been mismanagement of the economy, and that people were already pretty fed up. And then to find out that these guys, the people running the country have basically been fiddling their expenses was just one thing too far. And I think that's why people are so angry about it. I think in a different context, at a different time, it would have been a scandal, but not of the same magnitude. I think there's a legitimate concern there about the way that things have been done. I also agree that the way that the Telegraph published it was primarily structured to sell newspapers in a tabloid style rather than, I mean, that's the media and that's how it can be. In terms of other unintended consequences, it's absolutely true that if information comes into the public domain and it shows problems in governance, it shows corruption, it shows abuse of power, and nothing is done about that, there's no prosecutorial actions, no one goes to jail, that can engender greater cynicism. So how to manage that? It's very difficult. I think one thing is that people probably were already a bit cynical already. People know about corruption. They know about the problems. The question is then taking the information and really channeling it in a way that it can be used to bring about change. And that's a challenge for civil society. And the other thing is to not only put this emphasis, and Roberto mentioned it in the context of Argentina, not only put the emphasis on access to information for accountability after the fact, but to shift the emphasis more to access to information for participation in decision-making, access to information for empowerment, access to information for engagement. And I think that if that is done, then we can mitigate some of those potential damages, if you like, of greater transparency.
Roberto, you can have the last word.
Very shortly about the unintended consequences. I think that, of course, there are some challenges there, but I think that I would be more concerned about how to take advantage of the scandal. As you said, I mean, I have been working for some years on corruption, and we were also very concerned about how the media was just exposing scandals without making a connection to policy, to what would be necessary to do in order to. So I think that it's like in free speech. I'm not afraid of the consequences of free speech or the consequences of openness, but I think we should, as activists, be very much aware of how to use the scandal in order to produce some positive results and policy.